There's something that humans do, something that's really quite delightful, beautiful even, yet something that when you notice it, at first is jarring, frightening perhaps, and people will fight very hard not to believe it when first someone brings it to their attention. Every human civilization, every society, and every social order is built around an origin myth. People require stories. Societies are bound together by collective belief in stories. There's something quite delightful in this, that the way humans operate has been much unchanged since they gathered around campfires, that the basis of modern complex civilizations is much the same as a group of families telling tales. Over time, the nature of these stories has changed, and just because something is a story doesn't mean it's entirely untrue. Yet for society to be bound together, they do need to forget some things in common. Civilizations will simplify the past, turn complex history into more fantastic, heroic legend, and extract out the lessons that are needed for the basis of that civilization, or that particular political order. American society and English civilization historically have built their iterated periods off of a chain of stories. In our modern world, we live in the social political order of the liberal world order, a system of international free markets and financialization, of global bodies, a belief in the concept of the rules-based order, one where vast bureaucratic state apparatuses are very closely involved in the lives of all people. This is the managerial progressive state, and these twin orders justify themselves by telling a story of the 20th century. In the United States, these are the stories of the Great Depression, the New Deal, the Second World War, and the Civil Rights era, the beginning of the new mid-century order. So let's begin from a high-level view. What is the story that justifies our modern order, our political and economic structure, that professes the right to rule for the elite of this order, that explains the philosophical grounding, and gives direction for where this order wishes to go in the future? This is a story that everyone is taught as a child, and is routinely re-inculcated with throughout life, for this social order requires that all people believe in this narrative, for it justifies all. I will tell the story in the very simplified manner that so many have grown accustomed to, a sort of high-order telling that is both a quite common understanding and is the true functional core of what is acting as the foundation myth. The story goes that in 1929, the wild excess and greed of Wall Street and the financial markets of the era had spiraled too out of control and caused a financial crisis, the crash of 1929. Afterward, the country sank deep into an economic depression. Vast swaths of the population were unemployed, and those who were not found themselves in dire economic circumstances. The country was devastated. Further compounding the issue, there were a series of crop failures, and thus the risk of famine rose. Realizing that the old economic order had failed, the American people elected Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He came in, and through careful administration and through inspiration, wielded the power of the state to put the country back together again. That stimulus efforts, vast construction projects, and the heavy hand of the progressive state, which heavily regulated and involved itself in the economy, pulled the country out of depression and back on the path to prosperity. Yet as this process was unfolding, dangers were lurking off in the horizon. In Europe, Germany had been devastated by the First World War, and out of its ruin, an extreme and radical regime rose. This regime bound the country together by a fanatic love of nation and ethno-supremacism, which demanded that the German nation must expand, and so the National Socialist Party of Germany would build up its war machine, aggressively militarizing the nation, invading into neighboring lands, seeking to conquer all. Britain, which had been badly beaten down in the First World War, looked upon the situation in the continent. Knowing of its and Anglo civilization's role, it knew that it had to do something. Yet at first it was frightened, its weak leadership bent, believing that appeasing foreign tyrants would work. Yet ultimately this would fail, because the Germans saw this as weakness. Soon the French succumbed to the German war machine, and under new, more heroic leadership, Britain declared that it would stand alone, fighting the menace until the end. The United States, as a heroic and shining beacon to freedom and democracy, began supplying Britain, guaranteeing that it would be the arsenal of democracy. Yet, on the other side of the world, another force fueled by fanatic expansionist nationalism would rise. The United States would step in, attempting to tell the Japanese that there were lines it could not cross. The United States would attempt to keep the Pacific safe. Yet the fanatic Japanese would not listen, and in a bold and fanatic move, they would launch a surprising attack on the American fleet at Pearl Harbor. The United States was now directly involved militarily, and so, with the centralized power of the progressive state under Roosevelt, America would marshal the power of its industry, all Americans working in furtherance of the cause of liberalism and democracy. And so America would fight in two theaters. It would join up with Britain in Europe, beginning a campaign through North Africa and up through Italy, all while secret plans were launched to invade the European continent through northern France. America and Britain were the world's last hope. If they did not defeat the Germans, then Germany would conquer the entire world, killing everyone who wasn't German or enslaving them. It would be liberal democracy for the world, or the brutal police state of German National Socialism. If we didn't win, everyone would be speaking German. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, the Americans would begin an amphibious campaign, hopping from island to island, slow and steady, making progress and clawing back the gains of the brutal Japanese Empire. Back in Europe, the Germans were becoming more fanatic. They were becoming increasingly threatened by their circumstances in the war. In their fanatic bloodlust and hate, they would round up vast swaths of gypsies, homosexuals, communists, dissidents, and in particular, Jews. Actually, they're really the only guys you have to remember. And they would send them off into camp networks for systematic execution, landing them in mass graves or burnt. All while the war raged, they would become more and more fanatic. Their police state would crack down, and even when pressed for resources, they would instead myopically fixate on killing every undesirable. Despite not knowing about this, America was somehow generally aware of this, and so now knew that it was a fight to save the world from a death cult. Yet through bold action, superior leadership, the superiority of liberal democracy, and the raw industrial might of progressivism, America produced at such a staggering rate, and its men fought with such purity of conviction, that bit by bit, America and Britain would push the Germans back into Germany. Meanwhile, the Soviets were doing something else over there. Don't worry, I'm sure they played a minor role somehow. Yet, back in the Pacific, things were looking hairy. The campaign was very difficult, and the Japanese were blind, unthinking fanatics. They were so fanatic and irrational that they began crashing their planes into American ships. Yet, America had a trick up its sleeve. Under the progressive state, America had found all of its top minds, its top geniuses, who all came together to work on a secret project for liberal democracy. None of them were communists. And so the Manhattan Project built America's secret weapon. And there might be some other projects, but don't worry about the other projects. After the very straightforward death of Franklin Roosevelt that we won't come back to, the new president, Harry Truman, was faced with a difficult dilemma. The weapon that had been created by these geniuses was just too destructive. He certainly didn't want to use it. He couldn't rain that devastation on Japan. After all, the sheer scale of destruction, nothing had been seen like that in the course of the war. Yet America knew that the Japanese would never surrender. They were so fanatic that they would fight to the death and everyone would die. They had to use this weapon to save lives. And so America unleashed its secret weapon, showing the raw power of the atom bomb and forcing the Japanese to surrender. After the war, the United States entered and rebuilt Japan into a prosperous liberal democracy. Meanwhile, in Europe, they had to be prosecuted for their crimes. And so a fair and impartial commission was brought together to get to the truth. Because we believe in things like the due process of law and the careful examination of evidence. We gave the German officials and officers fair trials as we investigated them for war crimes. What we found was shocking. They indeed were a fanatic death cult who wanted to take over the world. And in their project, they had engaged in deranged medical experimentation and a mass murder campaign. And so, we put the criminals to death. Why did some of them show up here working for us? That's not part of this. And so, with the liberal democracies of the United States and Britain, who had been great friends for so long, now the rightful stewards of the world, the victorious powers would set about to build a world where this would never happen again. The new American system, we drop the Anglo bit at this point, just American now, would enshrine a system of free trade, a system with the dollar at the center, a system where all the world could get along and could rise to prosperity together through innovation and commerce. Meanwhile, new international bodies would be created so that countries could come together and talk through their differences, arrive at settlements through careful mediation so that warfare would never be necessary. And should some nation ever want to go on a maniacal spree ever again, the nations of the world could come together and use the power vested in them via international law to put a stop to it. The world would now be governed by rules and international consensus. So of course the American military had to be absolutely everywhere for international law and consensus. Meanwhile, back in Eastern Europe, the Soviets that were kind of a minor character earlier are now a really big problem. And we now see that they're trying to take over the entire world for communism, which is a lot like National Socialism but different-y. They believe that all of the economy of a nation should be tightly controlled by the government and that there should be no freedom, while we believe in freedom and that the economy should be tightly regulated, but also with corporations as a part of the general thing. And we looked upon the devastation in Europe. And so, because we're so magnanimous and generous, we knew that we had to rebuild Europe, or else they would become communist. And if they became communist, they would side with the Soviets. So we poured an enormous amount of money into rebuilding Europe. Now, a self-interested power might inject their institutions and bribe politicians. They might do some sort of shady finance, maybe assert military control, but we didn't do any of that. We just rebuilt them like the good guys we are. So there we are. America is on top. We have rebuilt Europe, built a new global commercial system where everything is great, and we're never gonna fight anymore because we're all getting rich together. And there won't have to be any more wars, at least big wars, because now we all follow the rules and talk out our differences. And now, because we never want any of that to happen again, it's very important that people never feel too much national pride. And people really shouldn't be thinking of themselves as peoples. Really, we're just a big international mush. Because the love of your country is going to cause a genocide. Which, oh yeah, this really hasn't been brought up yet, but actually the Holocaust is what the war was really about. And that's going to be the most important topic for everyone forever. You see, the thing that America and Britain really cared about was the Jews. And whoever else was there, they're unimportant. So now we could turn our attention to back at home. Back in America, the country was getting very rich very fast because of all of our output during the war. We had this incredible productive capacity. And inflation was low because it was. And so America entered into a boom time. Everyone started having children. And it was just great. But deep down we knew we weren't living up to our liberal ideals. You see, the Southerners were being really unfair. Why? Because they just hate people for no reason, and Northerners are better than them. You see, they're just stupid hicks. So the rich people in the northern coasts should be in charge of them. You see, they were awful to the black population, and they hated them for the color of their skin, which sums up the entirety of that social dynamic. And so the progressive state had to step in. You see, America was realizing the error of its ways. During the war, black and white troops had fought together side by side. It happened all the time. Tons of black troops. And so the troops coming home realized, hey, these guys are all right. But there were some old bigots who hadn't realized this yet. And so, a group of peaceful Christian demonstrators got together, and through the conviction of their mission and dedication to being peaceful, would conduct marches and give speeches, making everyone look around and say, you know, we really need to be more fair. And so, the progressive state would create an entire new social code. One that said that black and white Americans had to integrate with each other, that businesses could no longer refuse service, that they had to hire. In order for all things to be fair, there had to be control over association, which is unrelated to freedom of association. And so once again, the wise, progressive state took another leap forward for liberalism. Now with all these new freedoms and opportunities, the black population was finally able to get rich, and they would integrate very well into white America. Everything was looking up for them. Nothing got worse for them. Everything improved. And they were never used for raw political self-interest. And so that's why things are the way they are. The progressive state proved that the heavy hand of the progressive government could make things better for all people. If it weren't for Roosevelt, we'd still be in the Depression for 10, 20 more years. The state requires administration. Bureaucracy is prosperity. And the state must be involved. Because if it weren't for such heavy involvement of the state, then all of those stupid, backward, hick bigots would be making black people ride in the back of the bus purely because of their skin color. You see, the liberal state raised people up. And after the experience of the Second World War, we all learned that we should all get along and all integrate. And that's the same for the whole world. We never want the world of the 1930s and 40s again. Because if we didn't step in, then the Germans would have conquered the planet and killed maybe everyone. We'd all be speaking German. We saved the world. And that's why we run it, not for ourselves, but for the rules, for liberal democracy. So is that story true? No. Of course that's not true. That's an over-the-top, childish, cartoon fairy tale story. But it does have a function. There's no possible way to justify an international rules-based order where the American military is everywhere on the planet if it weren't for something like this. The enormous administrative state would never be accepted if it couldn't tell this story. The ruling coastal elite, everyone would just think they're idiots if they didn't have this story. They have to tell the story of raising people up, of fairness, that this is the great mission and triumph of liberalism. If it weren't for this story of marches, peaceful protests, people coming together and wanting a more fair country, then it would be absolutely impossible to justify what is functionally a new constitution of the 1960s. Why? Because many constitutional rights were directly violated by these changes. The most glaring one being freedom of association. And think about everything that was built off of it. Things like affirmative action quotas. That would be impossible to justify in the world before. The system requires this story. We'll explore some of what's wrong with the story later, but first it's worth noting that this is just what societies do. There isn't something inherently wrong about having a fairy tale at the start of your era. That is how human societies bind together. Every society does it, and we've done it many times over our history. It is very jarring to realize that these foundational stories aren't true. That can be terrifying. Some people are entirely afraid that if people were to realize this, then everything would fall apart. Then we might, for some reason, do the exact opposite of what we're doing now. And perhaps to some degree that could happen. There's a real question as to just how load-bearing these stories are. If people stopped believing, then would we all go to war? Would we be just like Germany or Japan? Probably not. But there probably would be some serious cracks in the social fabric. But belief in these stories come and go over time. they change. New stories become the basis of new systems. And just because the collective story is fantastical, doesn't mean there isn't a true story underneath it. These stories, most of the time, are based on things that did happen. And though these stories seem so fundamental, so important, they can't last forever. Eventually they fall apart. Distance from the event, the death of those who remember that time in history, and the slow and steady loss of emotional resonance and salience all make it so that stories aren't functional forever. Eventually, these deep and emotional mythic origin stories just become history. After all, how emotionally invested are we in the 30 Years' War? Perhaps the Norman Conquest? The founding of Rome? Eventually, they just aren't immediate for us. And so there's a pattern of old stories fading away to be replaced with new problems requiring new solutions, new crises, and a new story of why we are in the new system. And there seems to be a really remarkable means by how we are able to reinvent our stories every few generations. The mid-century story of our current social order is far from the first story that we have told ourselves. In the America of before these events, the most recent such story had been the Civil War. In the mythic telling of that story, a bunch of rebels who really wanted slavery declared that they were breaking away from the American Union. They set up armies and became belligerent, yet the Union of the Northern States, led by Abraham Lincoln, refused to accept this. They refused to accept the Union being torn apart. And so through a brutal war, with a high cost of lives and resources, the Union Army who believed in America fought to keep the country together. Afterward, the magnanimity of the North was on full display. Instead of being punitive toward the South, they came in to reconstruct the Southern states back to prosperity. In the world afterward, this reunited United States was a powerhouse, and it entered an industrial boom, becoming a truly dominant economic player, rising to be one of the great powers of the world. This story is as well extremely simplistic. There are a great many nuances that are entirely ignored. The true nature of the Reconstruction period almost entirely glossed over. The lead-up to the conflict, the involvement of external foreign powers, and in particular, the economics and finances of the situation, were all omitted to tell a simple story of rebels who wanted to tear the country apart, and the heroes who fought to keep it together. Not to mention the fact that the Lincoln administration, along with a great deal of the Northern government, would have entirely accepted keeping slavery around to keep the country together. This was not the moral crusade people think it is. There was more nuance. Yet this story was the perfect backdrop for the industrial America of the latter 19th and early 20th centuries. Plus, it gave a moral justification for the sense of superiority that the North had, if perhaps done with more subtlety, saying that the South should be poor and backward, because it was the land of fools who fought for slavery. It perfectly told a story about what the United States could be, what the purpose of the Union was, and it as well justified a great number of economic moves that the much more powerful federal government would make. Now, many notions that had been ubiquitous prior to the war with respect to states' rights could be associated with the rebels. This in turn justified a much more powerful federal government, a federal government that could not justify itself before the war. Prior to that, the story was that of the American Revolution, that a bunch of liberty-minded colonists banded together, and through sheer grit and cunning, motivated by a philosophical vision of liberty, were able to throw off the oppressive colonial yoke back in London. This too is simplified and fairy tale-ish, but if you're trying to build an entirely new country from the ground up, you need such stories. If we wish to go prior to this story, then we have to look back into English history. Before that, the origin story was the Glorious Revolution, the story told of an abusive, tyrannical Catholic monarch, one who at the first sight of danger fled, giving up his throne in a flight of cowardice. In turn, Britons would get together. A new king and queen would be invited in. Yet this time, led by the Parliament, a new Bill of Rights would be forced on the monarchy, guaranteeing the rights of Englishmen. This story was as well untrue. The fall of the Stuart dynasty was not so simple. The revolution was far from glorious, as there were decades of constant warfare afterward. And there were a whole lot more political machinations. There was a whole set of rising financial power players, influence from the continent, and really just a whole lot more shenanigans. But this story was a perfect backdrop for a Britain in the Age of Enlightenment. This origin story, in turn, would motivate the American revolutionaries. Yet just as our story is beginning to fade, at the time of the Revolution, the American colonists realized that the glorious revolution and the guarantees of the Bill of Rights weren't really as solid as the story told, that the Crown and the Parliament were violating their rights. And so in great part, the American Revolution was an effort to make good the promises of the glorious revolution. Yet we can go back further. This England built itself off of the story of the English Civil War, a clash between an overreaching absolutist monarch and a Protestant parliament who put him in his place, guaranteeing the rights of the parliament. They lived in a world that was defined by the story of the Henrician reforms and the political revolutions of the Tudor era, one where England had separated itself from the tyranny and corruption of the Catholic Church in Rome, a story justifying the political entity of the Church of England and the new relationship between church and crown, laying the foundation for the idea of England as a Protestant nation. Further back and back we go. The story of the War of the Roses, the story of the Peasants' Revolt and the Black Death, the story of King John, the Barons, and Magna Carta. Before that, the Norman Conquest, and the dawn of Angevin England. At some point, we don't really know what the stories were, yet at every point, there was some foundational tale that people told themselves as to why things were the way they were, and why that was justified. Before Norman England, there were the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Before that, the Celtic Britons. And though we may not know the stories of the Neolithic tribes of Doggerland, we can be reasonably confident that they were telling themselves their own tales. Throughout all time, some crisis emerges. The crisis is dealt with, entrenching a new social order. Yet this order must explain itself. It must justify why it is the way it is, and society must come to believe in the order. There will always be incongruent elements. There will always be lingering problems, and so history isn't enough. People need to agree to collectively forget about some things, to believe in fantastical elements, and to come together to collectively believe something bigger than just a story, some sort of social mythos of the age. Before we return to a more granular analysis of our story, it's worth taking a moment to look at just how far-reaching this is, and the very different styles and forms these stories have taken on at different times and amongst different peoples. Some of these stories are smaller in scope, demarcating a particular era, a particular system, yet some stories exist to explain entire civilizations and the existence of peoples themselves. So let's take a look at some of the great ones, the big, deep legends at the start of civilizations. One of the greatest and most legendary civilizations of all time was Rome. Yet for the civilization that would one day rise to become a multi-continental empire controlling the Mediterranean, it had to once begin as a much smaller city, and for this civilization to motivate its growth, to explain why its systems and ways were the way they were, and why its elite were who they were, it had to first tell a story of where it came from. The story of the founding of Rome is that of the twin brothers Romulus and Remus. So the story goes, in 753 BC, at Palatine Hill, twin sons of the god Mars were abandoned, yet they would survive, being nursed by a she-wolf. These two wild demigods would grow up strong, resilient, resourceful, and they would build a city. After the building of the city, Romulus would build a sacred boundary wall, demarcating the borders of Rome. Yet Remus would mock this boundary, jumping over the wall in disregard of its sanctity. In response, Romulus would slay Remus, making it clear that the rules of Rome, the sanctity of Rome's boundaries, came before the bonds of brothers. Romulus would invite in outlaws, runaway slaves, and exiles, growing Rome as an asylum for outsiders and outcasts. Eventually, Rome would grow to become the Great Republic, and later the vast empire. Vast, materialistic, and assimilative. Unlike the Greek states, which were built around ethnic bonds, and very concerned with ethnic purity, Rome would assimilate people from all over, and they would need to be bound by the Roman social code. And so, just as Romulus had slain Remus, Roman civil law came above familial bonds. And just as the city had been an asylum for outcasts, Rome would grow by bringing people in, much less concerned with familial and ethnic ties. In truth, this probably didn't happen. Yet just as Rome had grown from a loose association of pastoral tribes into a disciplined, administrative, and expansionist warrior empire, this story tells the tale of wild brothers building a disciplined society. It's a perfect origin story, and it justifies why Rome is the way it is, making very clear that civil code comes above family, creating the perfect backdrop for what would one day become the Roman Empire that we all think about between every few hours to every few days. The true origins of Chinese civilization are shrouded in legend and uncertainty. Traditional Chinese legend describes the foundation of Chinese civilization as the Xia dynasty, nearly 4,000 years ago, by the Yellow River. In Chinese legend, catastrophic floods had for generations wreaked havoc on the Chinese people. Many tried to build dams, yet failed. However, one man, Yu, spent 13 years organizing massive public works projects, dredging riverbeds, and cutting channels to guide the water to the sea. He worked tirelessly. His hands would become calloused, and he would develop a permanent limp. The story tells that as he was working all along the Yellow River, he would pass his home 3 times without ever entering, always putting his project and the people above his own personal desires. Eventually, because of Yu's tireless and thoughtful work, the flooding of the Yellow River ceased, and Chinese civilization could flourish. In legend, he is known as Yu the Great, or sometimes Yu the Engineer, and he is a perfect tale, justifying Confucian meritocratic bureaucracy, the hydraulic state. For while in other flood myths, like the Hebrew, Christian, and Sumerian, divine intervention is what saves people from the flood, in the Chinese story, it's hard work, discipline, and competence, placing civic obligation to one's people above personal desires. China would develop into a system of a vast Confucian bureaucracy, one where the leadership of China was justified by the mandate of heaven, where it was not one's bloodline, but instead one's competence and results that justifies his position. Yu is the archetype of this, saying that China itself was built by someone civically minded who got results. Yu embodies the mandate of heaven, using his sharp mind, innovating a solution, and then dedicating 13 years to a public works project. An ancient Chinese proverb tells that without Yu, we should all have been fishes. And though in truth, nomadic peoples slowly organized into complex agrarian civilization, that doesn't mean the story of Yu is meaningless. In fact, it's functionally true. For though the man himself may just be legend, the idea of a people building in this manner, dedicating their lives to civic projects, and overcoming their problems with very organized efforts, is how China came to be. So if perhaps Yu isn't a man, Yu is the Chinese people. And so Yu the Great, in the taming of the Yellow River, not only justifies why China is the way it is, justifies the Confucian bureaucracy, explains an origin for the mandate of heaven, and gives an argument for a highly organized administrative society, but perhaps in a deeper sense, tells the story of the character of China and the Chinese people themselves. The Aztec origin story is quite different altogether, for in the case of this civilization, they transformed from nomadic tribes to a settled and highly sophisticated empire. The story goes that the nomadic Mexica people were poor mercenaries, raiders, and quite despised by those around them. They were about as low as a people could be. Yet in the 14th century, the god Huitzilopochtli would command the Mexica nomads to leave their homeland. In Aztlan, they were told that they would find a divine new homeland. Yet they were not told where, told simply to wander, and that they would know where to settle when they saw the sign of Huitzilopochtli, an eagle sitting on a prickly pear cactus with a snake in its mouth. So the story goes that the Mexica wandered, until ultimately they found this exact image, the eagle, snake, and cactus, on an island in the middle of Lake Texcoco. There they would settle, building the city of Tenochtitlan. Yet as they were given this divine homeland, they owed a debt to Huitzilopochtli. This new Aztec civilization had to sacrifice to him the hearts of captured warriors, for if they didn't, the sun would die. What this story accomplishes is gives an origin for divine mandate, and it as well justifies aggressive expansion, saying that the very reason the empire exists, the reason Tenochtitlan was built in the first place, was because of an agreement with Huitzilopochtli, one which demanded a constant supply of captured enemy warriors. So for the society to exist itself, they had to continue to expand and capture more enemies, offering up their hearts to the god. This settlement in the middle of Lake Texcoco forced rapid development and the building of advanced floating gardens in order to address the swamps. The construction of these gardens would lead to an agricultural boom, allowing the Aztecs to become quite wealthy and sophisticated, though with such aggressive practices, certainly not one well loved by the other peoples around them. Maybe the best well-known of these such stories in the West is the foundation of Israel, and I'm not talking about the Balfour Declaration. This is the biblical story of Exodus. In the story, Egyptian slaves were led by the prophet Moses, an abandoned orphan raised in the house of the Pharaoh, who was tasked by God to lead the slaves out of Egypt and to their promised homeland. Through God, Moses would deliver plagues unto the Egyptians, and when at last the devastation became sufficient, the slaves were cut loose. They would wander through the desert for 40 years, in that time receiving the commandments, the moral law that would undergird Israel's society, at Mount Sinai. The journey would see these slaves change greatly in mindset as new generations came. They would be made to give up their old practices and their old gods and idols, and through this hardship and long wandering, become worthy of the promised land. Ultimately, they would arrive at and conquer the promised land, forming what would be the Kingdom of Israel. This story is very remarkable for its innovation, the concept of a portable deity. For almost all human civilization prior, gods were rooted to the land of a people. The idea that there was one god who your people had a special personal relationship with that could exist anywhere in the world was very novel. And it's extremely valuable for a people who exist scattered across the world, allowing for them to retain a coherent identity while existing in a diasporic, semi-nomadic existence. This is as well a fundamental persecution myth, forming the foundation for a set of future such myths, all driving home the same fundamental idea that would be very important for what the society would grow into. The fundamental idea in each iteration being, we were kept down, we were abused, they tried to kill us. Yet, because of our relationship with God, we persevered, and now we thrive. Yet always remember, because it might happen again. The story of Exodus would become fundamental in Christian thought as well. In truth, it appears as though associations of Canaanite hill tribes around the 6th century BC consolidated into a kingdom, and did not form after a vast voyage for generations across the desert. Yet in what would ultimately become modern Judaism and the Jewish schools of thought, it lays a perfect groundwork for a diasporic people who need to retain a coherent identity across the world, and to act as one unit while scattered, able to continue their civilization wherever they are on the planet. The last of these great, fundamental, civilizational origin myths that we will look at in this video is the Enuma Elish, the origin story for Mesopotamia. In the legend, the young god Marduk engaged in fierce battle with the primordial dragon of the chaotic salt ocean, Tiamat. Marduk would be victorious, splitting her corpse, taking one half to form the sky and the other earth. After he would build the world from the dragon's corpse, he would create the stars and the calendar. Yet, after this great creation, he would seek rest. Humans would be created to farm so that the gods could rest. There's a very fundamental symbolic interplay between order and chaos in this story. In the legend, Marduk is the creative will that brings order from chaos, not only defeating chaos, but building the world out of the corpse of chaos. Historically, rapid urbanization of Sumerian and Babylonian city-states around 1800 BC resulted in a complex civilization with rigid civil laws, and this story tells why this civilization follows the laws over the ways of nature. That civilization is bringing order from chaos. In Mesopotamian civilization, the king would be seen as Marduk's representative on Earth, and in turn this tale would justify taxes, laws, why people need to farm, and why canals and walls had to be built. Something that's really remarkable about this story is that it does more than justify Mesopotamian civilization and order. To a great extent, it justifies the idea of civilization itself, with the very fundamental story that in civilization, we do what we do, the order is as it is, and the rulers are who they are, because this is creation bringing order from chaos. Not all foundation myths are on the same scale. Some are very deep, often religious stories. They answer deep metaphysical questions, and they tell the origins of entire peoples and civilizations. Yet most tell the origins of a particular political social order, and most don't last all that long. Just in the modern era, the French Revolution told the story of the triumph of the sovereign will of the people over the corrupt, oppressive ancien regime that had kept the French people down. In truth, the French Revolution was heinously brutal. It was wildly misguided. It was filled with cruelty and purity spiraling, and the nation fell apart. But without that story, how would it have put itself back together again? The French Republic needed to tell itself something. In the 1860s, the Japanese martial ruler, the shogun, was overthrown, and the historic divine emperor was reinstated to the Japanese throne. At this time, Japan was at a crossroads. It was being forced to interact with the broader world. It knew that it needed to industrialize, and perhaps to some extent, westernize. But it did not want to become like the West. It did not want to lose its culture and tradition. So the story of the Restoration told that the traditional and divine order had been reinstated, and so Japan could go forward with industrialization and growth, because its backbone was tradition. The Marxists of the Russian Revolution would tell the story of the vanguard state. In their origin myth, the cruel, oppressive, backward czar and feudal nobility were overthrown by the will of the people, creating the dictatorship of the proletariat. In this story, the new cruel, oppressive, totalitarian Soviet regime that was emerging, ultimately forming into a coherent state in 1922, was nothing like the old system. This was absolutely not an elite abusing the people, for the people had their own dictatorship. This was a rule of and by the people. Yes, it was a dictatorship, but a dictatorship of the proletariat. And so too, in the story, the Bolshevik movement and the state that was being created was only the first of many, heading to the glorious end state of humanity, international communism. This story would justify the entire Soviet ruling class, Soviet law, and ultimately the sheer scale of the Soviet Union itself. In 1979, the Iranian Revolution would unfold. In this revolution, the secular and Western Pahlavi dynasty would be overthrown in an Islamic revolution, bringing in the exiled Ayatollah Khomeini to rule as the top religious scholar over the emerging new state. The story of the revolution is quite nuanced, because they were not bringing back the traditional Shia doctrine of political quietism, yet they were most certainly overthrowing Western monarchism. Instead, the story told that the proper state for the Islamic Revolution was the rule of the Islamic jurist, with the state as a sacred republic under the direct custody of Islamic scholars, at least until the Mahdi would return. This story allowed for the idea that modernization was not synonymous with secularization, and justified a democratic voting system with supreme religious veto. Ultimately, the clerical class wasn't entirely in charge, and the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps quite often was. And today, in the context of our own foundation myth, we find ourselves in a tricky spot. Belief in the story is falling apart. To many, this is absolutely terrifying, for some believe that if our society doesn't believe in these stories, with a sort of religious quality to them, then the world will just descend into being what it was during the Second World War. The story of the Second World War and the subsequent civil rights era of progressivism really aren't just a political story. It's a religious story. For who are the Germans in World War II? Well, in the modern liberal context, they are demons. This story tells of a secular Satan. What a Christian thinks when he uses the term satanic is functionally the same to the role that this story plays for the secular liberal. So of course they have enormous terror at the idea of this moving from the realm of religious-like mythos to normal, nuanced history, filled with uncertainties, people asking questions, and a certain cold detachment. Yet the distance from these events is simply growing too large. Too few people even remember these events anymore, and so the salient simply is gone. Too many people don't feel that it's relevant in the way those in the wake of these events did, and so ultimately a new story will have to take its place. Yet though this is a natural process, though it's not wrong to point out the fairy tale-ish elements, the inconsistencies, and to simply lose the emotional attachment of the past, doesn't mean those with that attachment to it are entirely wrong either. These stories are important. They function as the core of an entire system. They explain the social structure and justify its elite. They explain and justify customs and behaviors. They act as the backbone and justification for the philosophical order of the age, the belief, religion, and ideology. In our world, this story has led to the progressive managerial state. It's led to the civil rights era legislation, executive orders, and regulations. It's led to the growth of liberalism as it has. It has kept the coastal liberal elite in power perhaps longer than they would naturally. It has justified the monetary and economic order of the world, and it has justified internationalization, international bodies, the rules-based order, and globalism. So for so many who feel failed by this era, who can see these systems and structures falling apart, that they no longer suit the world of today, for those who want to break free of the rules-based order, this economic model, and for those who can simply see that the post-war order can no longer sustain, just what is the problem? The problem is that there was a real history there too, and we most certainly don't want to reject any real lessons in there. As people discover the truth about stories like these, quite often the reaction is total rejection, lashing back at the origin story of the order they resent by becoming a caricature of its opposite, simply wishing to denigrate the sacred cows. Yet the problem isn't that we don't learn the lessons of history, it's that we myopically learn the fairy tale, cartoonish version of only one lesson at the expense of all the others. For example, one might look at the Second World War and say the lesson is that we should be bound by international obligation. We should get involved, fight preemptively, and we should have entanglements across the world, in order to ensure that nothing like that ever happens again. Yet if you learned that lesson, you would have learned the exact opposite from the lesson of World War I, which tells you not to have so many international entanglements, not to have a bunch of treaties, that trying to entangle your economies will not work, and that actually, maybe you should mind your own business. So what's wrong with that story? What's wrong with the story that has become the foundation myth? Well, for one, it really isn't a triumph of liberalism as we like to imagine it. The progressivism of Franklin Roosevelt was a whole lot more like a monarchy. And though there were some very impressive public works projects, the economic and monetary model really did not help the way the story tells. In fact, in many cases, the Depression may have been made worse. Yet, more than that, looking at the war, the Germans weren't trying to take over the planet. If we didn't step in, the world would not all be speaking German. The Germans, for their part, didn't even want to fight Britain. Yet the situation that Europe had found itself in was a very tricky mess at the end of the First World War, and the British Empire, for its part, was in a very precarious position. Now, if one raises some of these nuances, quite often the knee-jerk response is, well, you're saying the Germans are the good guys and the British and Americans are the bad guys? See, that's why I said these stories are for children, because that's how a child thinks. No, but history isn't clean. History isn't as romantic as we remember it. There were other roads that could have been taken. There were other interests that go neglected. There were self-interested reasons for what Britain did. This was not liberalism coming in to be the hero of everyone. You can look at really any element of the big story, and you are going to find spots where it just doesn't line up. You can raise questions of Pearl Harbor and America's entry into the Pacific. You might probe as to why America and Britain's involvement in China looked so very different. Perhaps you look back further into the history of Danzig and Königsberg. Perhaps probe further into why so many Britons and Americans were highly opposed to entering the war. At every turn, there are going to be complexities, but that doesn't mean you have to believe its opposite. You can believe in a nuanced, more gritty, and perhaps more troubling world. The civil rights movement did not unfold as the story told. Take a closer look at those figures. You'll see trained actors, communist agitators, groups working with the FBI and CIA, a whole suite of ulterior motives, and many of the most iconic events that were said to have stirred the hearts and shaped the minds of Americans, really just publicity stunts that were retroactively wedged into the story. That era was a lot more messy. That story was necessary to justify the post-war progressive state and the civil rights regime. Yet actually look at what happened to those communities that the state claimed it raised up. In this haphazard forced integration, entire black communities were destroyed. Many were growing businesses at a quite rapid pace, some even beginning to become wealthy. Though this was not universal, by the time of the 1960s it was increasing quite quickly. Family and marriage structures were doing very well. Black America had built itself communities, strong families, traditions, and tight bonds. But the world that the progressive state forced onto them destroyed a lot of that. Suddenly their businesses had to compete with others that they were not prepared for. And quite quickly, the welfare state destroyed families, elevated single mothers, and destroyed cultural and church bonds. A closer examination at what the progressive state did to those communities really looks a whole lot more like destruction. This story is a lot more like branding than history. So what do we do as people find this out? Because they will find it out. Well, maybe it's time to trust people. Maybe enough time has passed that people need to carefully and rationally examine what happened. Try to learn the lessons of history with more nuance, subtlety, and thoughtfulness. For right now, there are many who believe that the lesson of the Second World War is that people should not love their own people, and that nationalism almost ended the world. That is childish. What that story did is justified globalism and a global elite. It justified international bodies and the modern global financial system that has caused so much pain. No, the lesson isn't to forget about being a people. The story, that love of nation, that thinking of oneself as part of a people and caring about that people, was the root of evil in the 20th century and can never be allowed to happen again. So we must all forget about our nation's borders and peoples has caused tremendous suffering in the world of today. That myopic, simplistic message in today's world has destroyed nations and peoples. Because really, in history, its lessons are nuanced. And when you try to extract one simplistic lesson, you will forget all about what it must be balanced with. Just because you shouldn't fanatically hate others doesn't mean turn your back on your own people. Both can be true. Every civilization thought like that before, as did all of the allies. If you took someone today saying, well, nationalism was the problem, and showed their views to the people fighting on the American side in the Second World War, they would say, well, hold up, well, that's what I believe. That isn't what happened. What happened was a lot more of a political mess, a whole lot more nuances, and a whole lot more hardships that go unremembered. The heroes were a whole lot more self-interested, and the villains, often with their backs against the wall, more often than you know. Yet still, this doesn't mean believe the opposite. What it means is that this period of history is becoming history, and we are going to need a new story, and we are going to need to re-examine this period with sober and rational eyes. It isn't easy. I know it isn't easy, but we have done this again and again throughout our history, and at each turn, we have done amazing things. No doubt there will be horrors in the future, but there will also be greatness, and there will be people trying their best. So now a question remains. As this story falls apart, and this order falls apart, what will the next story be? Perhaps we are living in its formation, and if that's the case, then we will be amongst those who remember it happening. Maybe one day we will have great-grandchildren who are like us now. We will tell them our stories. The stories will become legend. One day the world they find themselves in will be simply too different, and in turn they will write their own. And hopefully, if we can retain heart, if we can retain a positive vision for tomorrow, and we can impart to them our spirit, a spirit that strives, remembers, cares, and believes in something greater than itself, something divine and beyond the ideologies of man, then maybe one day they can accomplish more than we can hope, more than we can imagine. and they will carry forth this mission that we have been on for lifetimes. Maybe one day they will grow, maybe one day improve on us, and they will build a world that we hope for them. Yet for now, we are in a time that is scary, and processes like these are frightening. But with trust, courage, conviction, and calm and careful minds driven towards something better, there's no reason we have to be afraid. So when that future comes, let us be able to tell a story, not of people who fought amongst themselves, not of a frightened people, but a people who boldly faced the future and tackled their problems, a people who were builders and not destroyers. And may the stories of us one day be of heroes.